It is already 8:40 though, so we should get started. I turned it off because I was still talking. Alright, so we'll go ahead and get started. Let's begin with the word of prayer. Father God, thank you for this time this morning to gather together. I pray that this would be a time that will be beneficial for us, Lord, that we would continue to grow in our confidence that your word is true, it can be trusted, that the resurrection was a historical event. And with that being said, with it being a historical event, Lord, that changes everything and gives us, or leaves us with a choice of how we're going to respond to that truth, that fact. So, Father, I just pray that you would keep everybody safe who is still traveling here. And thank you for getting us here safely with the roads the way they were this morning. And again, Lord, just bless our time here together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so we're going to start off with an activity. Actually, because we were talking about last week the divergence in details between the gospel accounts, differences that are things like, how many angels were at the tomb? Were there two? Were there one? Was the angel in the tomb, standing outside the tomb, on top of the tomb? And you notice that there's different differences. And I talked about how eyewitnesses to crime, for example, oftentimes point out different details. And, J. Warner Wallace, who was a homicide detective, he was an atheist, and he actually applied his detective methods to the New Testament and found that it checks out. But he talked about in one of his books, I believe it's Cold Case Christianity, he mentions that, one of the things that he mentions that he wants to get people separated. He doesn't want witnesses to come together. He wants them separated so he can get their individual stories, so he can get a better picture. That way they're not coming together and colluding with one another. That's very important. If you saw that every gospel account was exactly the same, then that would show evidence that actually those that created the story would have got together and colluded together to create the story, to make it up. But because you're getting differences in details, that actually gives some credibility to it. He mentioned in the book that I mentioned to you guys, like one of the eyewitnesses to a crime, to a robbing of a convenience store, and how the woman noticed different details than the man did. And they seemed to contradict with each other, but then on further examination, they really didn't contradict. It was just their different perspectives. And obviously, as an eyewitness, you're going to have different vantage points to things that you see, that you witness. And then afterwards, I was talking to Nip, and I don't know, Nip, did you want to share your experience? He saw that. He told me he actually saw that at work. You were on a jury. Huh? Yeah. Okay, right. You were on a jury, so you got different perspectives from different witnesses. Did you want to tell them about that, or? Okay, go ahead.
I served on a murder trial about 30 years ago, and what happened was a dozen people in a crack house in one room in the place, 9 feet by 20, and the woman went up to the guy and said something. Their language is go up
eyewitness. What did he say when they asked him, how did you know what he looked like?
Well, he said, because I liked it, I thought it was really neat.
Yeah. So he happened to notice that detail more than maybe some of the others because he particularly liked that jacket. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's funny also because there was actually some of the people in there in the trial wearing the deceased guy's clothing.
Uh-huh.
They wasted any time
Uh-huh.
around it.
Uh-huh.
Excuse was, you don't need it anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a group of.
Yeah. Great, thank you for sharing that. You can see that from his experience, I've seen that at work, how there are divergences in details. But what you will see, what you should see, if a story is true, is you're going to see on the main things of the narrative it's going to match up. And I think that the New Testament has even a better track record than that trial would have had. There's a lot of differences there. I think in pretty much every case with the New Testament, where there is a difference, it is really just a minor detail, and it's something that wouldn't be able to be explained by just the fact that maybe different eyewitnesses had a different vantage point from different angles of the events that they were witnessing. And so that does not take away then from the veracity of the Bible, just because there are minor differences. I think that the big ones with the angels at the tomb, how many were there, where were they, really could be a matter of like the timeline, at what point along the narrative timeline are we talking about here? Maybe there was two, maybe someone only saw one and the other saw two, and maybe at one point, yes, the angel was in the tomb, and maybe later it was outside, the angel was outside the tomb. Another one that a lot of people look at is the thief on the cross. There were two people crucified on either side of Jesus, and according to one of the Gospels, it says that they were hostile towards Jesus, and they hurled insults at him. Another Gospel account says that one of them actually said, "Hey, we're getting what we deserve," and he said, "Well, you remember me when you come into your kingdom?" And Jesus said, "Today I tell you, you will be with me in paradise." And they're like, see, they contradict, because in the one narrative, they're both hostile, and here one of them is hostile, and the other one is friendly towards him. And well, could it be that it's later on in the timeline, maybe after hanging there for a while, one of the thieves on the cross actually repented, and the other one just didn't report that part of the narrative. So there's lots of different reasons why you're going to have divergences in small details. And actually, J. Warner Wallace said that he said that's a great thing. He says that's exactly what you would expect if a story is true. You would expect, if you're getting it from multiple eyewitness sources, you're going to expect that there will be differences in the minor details. But obviously, we notice that there's nothing major like Jesus. In one narrative, rose from the dead, and the other one says he absolutely did not rise from the dead. Like, it's nothing like that. It's just the small, minor details. Let's just see. I'll try this. We'll try this activity here today, and we'll see how it works. I don't know. We'll see. I don't know. But you can see the directions on the screen. In a moment, Clyde's going to put a photo on the screen. And we're only going to do it for, I think maybe, it says on here 30 seconds, but I think, I did that in class. I think that was a little long, so we'll do it for 5 seconds, okay? Make it a little more challenging. And so you're just going to have 5 seconds to stare at the photo, and then you're going to write down every detail you see, paying very careful attention to any people in the photo, objects in the photo, and anything you see. Pay attention to what you see happening, what is taking place, what you think is taking place. Take note of any colors you see, placement, sizes, shapes, or any other details that you notice. We'll go ahead and we'll do this. So when I say go, then Clyde will put the photo up there. 5 seconds, just stare at it, take in as much as you can, and then give you a little time. You can write down some details that you noticed, and then we'll go around and we'll share and see how close they were to each other. All right, and go. All right. seconds, Clyde? Yeah, good. Okay, I thought 30 seconds was long, but 5 seconds was also very short. So. Let's see what you guys came up with. And by the way, last week I realized after the fact, I don't know what I was thinking. I didn't do the second part of that activity the correct way. I wouldn't know what I was thinking. Remember when we did the telephone game, we passed down the information, and then we did it the second way. And the only thing I did is I asked Clyde what he got, and I actually should have asked all of you. So do you guys remember? Did you pretty much have what Clyde did? Do you guys remember? Was it the same? You guys don't remember? Remember the activity we did? Where was it, Nip, was yours the same? Do you remember what we did? We went out in the hall and then we passed on that phrase.
Right.
Did yours match up with what Clyde had? Yeah, the first time it was just passed down from person to person to person to person, and by the time it got to Clyde, it had been corrupted, and it wasn't the same. But I was asking when we did it, where everybody went to Tracy, did you all have the same? Was it all the same? Angel, was yours the same?
It was close enough.
It was close.
It wasn't the same to me. It was too long for me.
Oh, it was too long.
Right.
Oh, it was too long of a phrase. Yeah. Yeah, because I realized afterwards, I was like, I didn't do that. All I did was ask Clyde, because Clyde was the last one to go out, and I was like, no, I should have asked everybody to compare to see how close it was. So, anyway, I apologize for that. I don't know if the point came through very well for that. But anyway, all right, Deb, what did you notice?
I noticed green avocados, kiwis, grapes, and parsley, and brown eggs, red cranberries, and cheese.
Okay, good. Nip.
Fruit avocado, peppers, nuts, sausage, and a big wooden spoon.
Okay. Angel.
A charcuterie board with sliced meat, uncut carrots to the left, kiwi, avocado, cranberries, and cheeses.
Okay. Good. Amy.
I had a slice of fresh fish on a cutting board or one that you can roast it on. Red beans and a row of bowls with beans in them. Bread on a board in the upper left corner. Avocado sliced in half. Whole carrots. A bunch of parsley on the right side. We had green grape clusters towards the center, kiwis that were cut, and a wooden spoon that had grains or beans.
Okay. You notice that you all had like your answers were different. Some of them were the same, but some of you tended to gravitate towards different things. Some of you noticed there was a charcuterie board or a spoon. Some of you said there was fish. Some of you only mentioned the fruits or the vegetables. Some of you said they were also nuts. And so Amy's list was quite long. She noticed a lot of stuff and was able to retain it. So yeah, so you can see differences, right? But you all looked at the same thing, you all noticed the same picture. But for whatever reason, whether it's where you're sitting, maybe you're knowing your background, maybe you're tended to notice certain things more. Maybe you like fishing, so you saw there was a fish. Maybe you don't like vegetables so much, and so you noticed there was different meats in there as well. So it will.
Avocados and lately I've been eating that.
Oh, yeah.
So
There you
I
go.
put it on that and there
Uh-huh.
are around it. So
She's been eating avocados a lot lately, so she noticed that right off the bat.
In Spanish culture, avocado is big, and I noticed that right away.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Are they big in Puerto Rico?
Huge.
Yeah. Good stuff. I like avocados. So we'll try again with a different picture. Let's do 20 seconds this time. How's that, Clyde? We'll do 20 seconds and then see what you notice in this next photo, what's going on. So put it up for 20 seconds. And describe what you think is happening in the scene. Alright, time's up. Okay, so try to describe what you saw as you saw it. Alright. You ready to share what you had, Deb? What did you see?
5 people, 2 were white, 3 were dark skinned, 2 were female, 3 were males. 1 was holding a paper. They appeared to be smiling or somewhat laughing about the paper. Saw textbooks on a large table. It was a sunny room with large windows. Thought it was a classroom until I looked around and saw a lamp and a chair. I wasn't sure what type of room it was.
Great. Very good. Deb?
2 women, 3 men, laughing, looking at papers, mostly young adults.
You said 2 women and 3 men as well? Yeah. Okay, so no discrepancy there. Alright. Angel?
I saw 5 people. 3 of them were dark skinned, 2 of them were light skinned. They either appeared to be at work or at school and were going over either good news or a report of good news because of the expressions on their faces. One of the women was wearing a white sweater and the other one was wearing a big top.
Okay. Thank you. Alright, Amy?
The room was filled with daylight. There was 2 windows. There were home plants in the background. The 5 people were like multicultural. There was the one woman was holding the paper. There was what looked like a floor lamp beside the windows. There were post-it notes
so you all were witnessing the same scene, but if you noticed, many of you pointed out very different details. I don't think in this case that anyone said anything that contradicted anyone else, but you can definitely see that, we had 4 people here that participated in that. You notice that the details you disagree on. Well, you all noticed that there were 5 people and they were at a table, right? They were all discussing something, they looked happy, right? But then different, each one of you noticed different things. And maybe that was a little bit like some of you weren't sure. Deb, did you say you weren't sure it was a school? Yeah, yeah. And then you said you weren't sure after that. And some of you are like, oh, it's more like a business meeting or something maybe, right? So you see how, your point of view, your perspective, and maybe your background might lead you to come to different conclusions about what you're seeing. But it doesn't negate the fact that you all witnessed the same thing. Okay?
I didn't say it, but the name said about the girl holding the paper. I thought the boy was holding the paper.
Oh, there we go. I didn't notice that. Thank you
There
for
was a
pointing
guy
that out.
holding the paper.
Yeah.
There was a gentleman holding the paper.
Yeah, so that.
I
Ah.
thought it was like the
I thought it was a guy.
one woman had the paper.
So that we.
Oh, thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah.
Trying to listen to you all was like information overload for my brain, so I wasn't able to process everything. So thank you for noticing that. So that does illustrate the point, right? You thought the woman,
No, I thought
the guy was,
she said the woman.
and she said the woman was, okay. And Angel, you said
Gentleman.
gentleman, yeah. Okay. So,
Yeah, I see it. We don't
yeah.
know who, so-
but we know for a fact that you all, you all witnessed the same scene. We know that, right? There's no way to verify it in the same way for the eyewitnesses of the New Testament, but it's like you can at least see how some, different people can see the same events and still report it differently and have different perspectives that are going to lead to divergence in details. And you would expect that when you're reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And like I said again, J. Warner Wallace said that the Gospels actually would be suspect if they were all the same. If it was just the same in every single detail, all the accounts that are reported in each one, if they were exactly the same, then, either it's just plagiarized, somebody just kept copied off the other ones, or, the eyewitnesses, or even not the eyewitnesses if they were making it up, would have got together and said, hey, let's get our story straight. Let's come up with a story and let's make sure all the details are the same. And that's why J. Warner Wallace tries to separate the witnesses. That's why here it worked, because you guys were writing it down on your own, and then I just had you share what you wrote, so it wasn't like you guys got together in a room and talked it out, right? And then said, oh, well, the woman was holding the paper. Oh, no, the guy was. Oh, well, 2 of you said it was one, and one of you said it was the other. Well, then I guess we got to go with the majority. Then you got your story straight. So I hope that illustrates the point. But let's move on to let's go ahead to the next section. Do that again, but we want to keep moving. Okay, evidence for the resurrection now. We're going to talk about, the resurrection of Jesus. So we talked about can we trust the New Testament? Is it reliable, even with the divergence in details? Let's talk about the resurrection. So we have to debunk some theories here today, because as I mentioned last week, most historians, majority of historians, and I'm not talking about Christian historians, I'm talking about any historian, and they've done not Christian, all agree on one basic fact, and that is that the tomb was empty. The question is why, or how did the tomb get empty? That's where they disagree, because obviously if you're coming at it from a secular, non-religious or non-Christian perspective, you're going to say, well, obviously the tomb wasn't empty because Jesus rose from the dead, because supernatural things don't happen, and he wasn't God, so of course he wouldn't rise from the dead. But it was empty, so how are we going to explain that? Well, there are some theories. We put them on the screen here. All right, these are the hoax theories. They would say that it was all a hoax. And last week we watched that video by Babylon B that I don't know, hopefully you guys found that as funny as I did. I thought that was hilarious. But here's the first one, the hallucination theory. All right, the disciples merely hallucinated the post-resurrection appearance of Jesus. So they were all just seeing things. Maybe they were on drugs or something like that. Okay? Can anybody see any problems with that, though?
If there's a room full of people that are on drugs, I think everybody's hallucination is going to be
Yeah, because where do your hallucinations originate?
in your mind.
In your own mind, and we all have different minds, and we are not going to hallucinate the same thing. Okay, whether it's drug-induced or whatever it is, you're not going to hallucinate the same thing. No two people, let alone 500 people, because remember, 1 Corinthians 15 mentions that there were 500 people that witnessed Jesus, the risen Jesus, at one time. So even if they all got together and said, let's take a drug so we can get into a hallucinogenic state and hallucinate something, sorry, but they're not all going to hallucinate Jesus back from the dead. So that theory is ridiculous. A lot of these theories, by the way, came out in the 19th century when there was this big push of questioning. There was a big push of what's called liberal theology. And we don't need to take the Bible as actual truth or actual history. And so they were pushing these theories, and that one's been debunked many times over. Number 2, the wrong tomb theory. This is basically just saying that the women went to the wrong tomb, and when they went, but they knew where the tomb was. They knew exactly where it was. They weren't stupid, and it was Joseph of Arimathea who had this freshly made tomb, and he took Jesus' body and he put it in his own family tomb. Like, I think if they would have went to the wrong tomb, they would have soon figured it out and said, oh, well, this must not be it because it's empty, let's go to the other one. But yes, everybody knew where the tomb was. Number 3, the swoon theory. Jesus only appeared to have died on the cross, he just swooned. So this one has been debunked many, many times over, because if you talk to a medical doctor and actually talk about what Jesus went through physically on the cross, and there is no way that anybody could survive what Jesus went through. Okay? I want to first point out that the Roman soldiers who did the crucifixions were trained killers. And they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how to make sure somebody died. And if they would fail at their job, guess what would happen to them? They would be killed too. So they were very efficient at their job, and they made sure that they carried it through. So we'll talk a little bit about what Jesus went through. First off, Jesus in the garden in Gethsemane. He's praying at night. His disciples are over there sleeping. And he prays, Father, not my will, but your will. And Luke, actually the Gospel of Luke mentions something that happens to Jesus physically. Does anybody remember what that is? In the garden. He sweats drops of blood, right? Yeah, good. And by the way, we talk about noticing different perspectives, right? And you said you're eating avocados lately, and so you noticed the avocado on the screen. Well, Luke was by profession, a medical doctor, and so of course he would be the one to point out that Jesus sweated drops of blood, because that's a medical condition. They wouldn't have had a name for it at that time, but today medical doctors would call it hematidrosis, and it's a very rare. It's very rare, it doesn't happen very often, but you can become so stressed that the capillaries burst and they come through your sweat glands, and the blood starts to seep out through your blood, or out through your sweat glands. And so hematidrosis is what that's called. And that would have put Jesus at already sort of a weakened state. He would have been, like that little bit of loss of blood, a little bit dehydrated already. It would have made his skin very sensitive, because later when he's arrested and then he's flogged, you got to keep in mind that like those floggings, the 40 lashes minus 1, were so terrible that that itself could probably kill somebody. It would have the cat o' nine tails. It would have had shards of like bone and like metal and things in there that would have just stuck into his back and just ripped flesh right off his back. His rib cage most likely would have been exposed just from that whipping. And so that would have been a lot of blood loss. And at this point, because of all the blood loss, he would have went into what was called hypovolemic shock. And that's a very, already at that point, that's a very critical medical state. And this is all before he gets on the cross. Now he's put on the cross, and does anybody know what actually kills you on the cross? Like, what do you actually die from? Yeah, asphyxiation. You suffocate to death, because when your arms are outstretched like this, you actually, in order to exhale, to actually breathe out, you have to lift yourself up, and imagine nails right through your hands. Okay, imagine, that feeling you get when you hit your funny bone. All right, imagine a nail going right through it, causing that constant funny bone pain. All right, and then you have to lift yourself up and down, and eventually you're going to get exhausted. You're going to get tired, and then you're going to die of asphyxiation because you can't breathe. Now, normally people would hang on the cross for several days. It takes several days for somebody to die. Jesus was already in such a weakened condition that he died within, 6 hours, I guess it would have been, right? Because, from 9 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. Yeah. So they actually, in the Gospels, it says they were very surprised that he died so early. And because it was the day before Passover, or the Sabbath preparation, or whatever, or the Sabbath, because of that, they didn't want to let bodies hanging on the cross during that time, so they had to get him down. So what they do, if they wanted somebody to help the process along a little bit, they would break their legs. And with Jesus, he already died, which actually helps fulfill a prophecy from the Psalms that says that not one of his bones will be broken. Of course, not one of his bones was broken, but because he was dead, and there was no sense in breaking his bones. So what they did, though, to make sure he was dead, so at this point, if he wasn't dead at this point, if he had only just swooned at this point, this next thing is what will kill him. What do they do next? Yeah, they send a spear right up through him, and it pierces his heart, and all this blood and water comes gushing out. And so if he wasn't dead before that, he definitely is now. So there's no way that Jesus could have survived any of what he went through. He was dead. You can ask any medical doctor and describe all the things that Jesus went through, and any medical doctor would say, yeah, that no one would survive everything that Jesus went through. So he was definitely dead. It's not like he fainted and then a few days later woke up in his tomb. That's just not going to happen. He wasn't buried alive. Number 4 a theory is the stolen body theory. This says the disciples stole the body of Jesus from the tomb. That one has been debunked many times over as well. And then there's the substitute theory that says someone else died on the cross that looked like Jesus, but it wasn't him, or sometimes they call it the twin theory. These are just absurd. Okay, so how do we know that the New Testament was telling the truth about these types of things? Okay, so first off, from archaeological evidence, we keep finding more and more evidence in archaeology that supports the Bible. It's astounding. It's a great book that I just got for Christmas and I just read. It's really good. Called Where God Came Down by Joel Kramer. He's an archaeologist that actually lives over in Jordan, and it's a great book. It has lots of pictures and things, maps. So if you're interested in that, it's great. So it talks about a lot of the places where, I guess the theme of the book is where, it's called Where God Came Down. So it's places where, people actually had an encounter with God, whether it was in the Old Testament or whether it was places where people actually had encounters with Jesus as God incarnate on earth. And it's a great book. I recommend that. Talking about how we can, and how people know where this stuff happened and where these events took place. A lot of people say, they'll try to say, well, there's no evidence for that. We haven't found evidence in the archaeological record for that, so that didn't happen. Well, that's a problem because you're just making an argument from silence. You know, just because we haven't found evidence of something doesn't mean it's not there, we just maybe just haven't found it yet. I forget the percentage of like maybe only like 1 or 2% of like what could be dug up right now. It hasn't actually been dug up. There's like 98% of sites that have not been touched. So like who knows what all we would find. But you know, obviously there's a lot of finances and politics involved in like being able to do those digs, right? So a lot of times a lot of them don't happen. But I'm trying to think, for example, for a while they said that King David, he didn't exist. He never existed. Why? No, there's no record of him, so therefore he's just a myth. He didn't exist. Again, that's ridiculous because just because you don't find evidence doesn't mean he didn't exist. And then guess what? In 1993, they found an inscription that said House of David, and now everyone acknowledges that. Oh yeah, there was a King David. Okay, all right. Or Pontius Pilate, he didn't exist, even though other historical records outside the Bible say he did. Well, then they found an inscription that had his name on it. And so we keep finding new finds that keep backing up the Bible, but what we don't find in any case is we've never found anything that contradicts the Bible. So it's not like any kind of new archaeological evidence comes to light and we're like, oh, well, that can't be true from the Bible because we found this. Like, that has not in any instance happened. What has happened, and that is like, for example, the Book of Mormon, that's an example where there's no archaeological evidence for that at all. And but the Bible has not, at no time have we found anything that disproves it. Luke is a good historian. Luke is very detailed in his account, giving his credibility more, increasing his credibility. He mentions a lot of things that will date it, like the census that took place, while Quirinius was governor of Syria. I know there's a lot of discrepancy about that and the timeline about that, but he is out there, he'll just say, this happened during the reign of so-and-so, or he'll mention geographical details. So if you're going to try to make something up, all right, you better check out all your facts and make sure all your details like that line up, because someone's going to point that out and say, yeah, you just made this up because this is just a piece of fiction. But in every case, everything, all his accounts, everything he's talking about, all the details check out. So there's a lot of credibility there with him. All right. The next slide, I think I already talked about that, the swoon theory, hematidrosis. Oh, well, you can go to that. There's a couple of points I didn't talk about here. Number 5 we didn't talk about. If Jesus had survived, so if he wasn't dead, why would a worldwide movement based on the belief that Jesus rose from the dead begin in the first place? Or, if Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, and he was dead, and he didn't come back from the dead, again, why would a worldwide movement start based on that belief? Think about it. Your leader, you're following him for 3 years, and he's, your expectation is he's going to be the Messiah, and he's going to save everyone, and then he dies. And then that's it. And he's dead. Are you then going to start a new religion based on our leader died? I think Christianity would be like a footnote of history. Look at the impact that Christianity and the church has had on the world in the last 2,000 years. It started a worldwide movement. Why would that start based on this idea of, your leader, the founder of this religion, just simply claimed to be the Messiah and then died? That doesn't make any sense. So something happened, and everybody knows something happened. It's just people are trying to figure out a way to explain it away and say why it didn't happen. Next slide says, where did Jesus' body go? As I mentioned before, Jesus' tomb was a historical fact. And I guess I can't say all historians, but most, and I'm talking about non-Christians, agree that it was empty. The creed, number 2, the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 precludes the possibility of the empty tomb being a legend, because that was, again, very early on. I don't know if you remember me saying this before, but the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 that Paul is actually quoting even atheist scholars like Bart Ehrman, who, you heard me right, like atheist New Testament scholar, right? He's like a New Testament scholar that doesn't believe in God, but even he will acknowledge that that creed is within 6 months or earlier of the resurrection. And so, he might not believe the resurrection, but he definitely debunks the idea that people try to say that the resurrection is legendary, that it came, centuries later or generations later. He said, no, from the get-go, from the start, Christians already believed that Jesus' tomb was empty and that he rose from the dead. Number 3, the fact that women discovered the empty tomb bolsters the story's authenticity. And you might say, why? What does that matter? Well, in first century Jewish culture, women were not considered to be viable witnesses in court. So, the Jewish law said that 2 or 3 witnesses, to verify something, and that's what the Bible says. But then they went a step further and said, but it has to be men, 2 or 3 men. Women cannot be trusted with making a credible eyewitness testimony. And so, if women were the first to see the tomb, this is kind of God's way of actually honoring women and actually giving them a very important role in a backwards kind of way, I guess you would say, because it's actually because of that fact that women were not considered credible witnesses that it ends up making this a credible story. Because if you were going to make up a new religion, right, in that culture at that time, and you wanted people to believe it, well, then you're not going to make up a story that women were the first to see the risen Jesus. You're just not going to use that, because everyone's going to say, yeah, right, they were women, we can't trust that, right? But the fact that women were the first, and they just simply reported the facts, shows that, they're just reporting the facts. Like, that's just what happened. Women were the first to see it. Now, if you notice later on, like, for example, in the creed of 1 Corinthians 15, there's no mention of the women at all in that creed. It says that he appeared first to Peter, and then the other apostles, and then so on, right? So it doesn't actually mention the women. But in the narrative, in the actual historical account, it says women were the first. And so that actually gives credibility that they may be telling the truth. They're just reporting the facts and letting the chips fall where they may. The site of the tomb was known by Jews and Christians, so it could have been checked by skeptics. They both knew where it was. That's what takes that wrong tomb theory, like that's what debunks that, because if the women, for example, would have went to the wrong tomb, and they would have said, oh, it's empty, he's not here, then the Jewish leaders could have said, well, actually, his tomb's right here, and here's his body. But they didn't do that. Everybody knew that was the tomb. And it was empty. And even the Jewish leaders of that day, like I said, historians today, I'll acknowledge it as well, but even in that day, at that time, the Jews, they knew where the tomb was, and they knew it was empty. They just had to explain why. And actually, the stolen body theory is the oldest theory, because that was what the Jewish leaders said. That's the story they spread around. The Gospels actually say that. It says they started to spread the rumor that the disciples stole the body, and it says, and that rumor has been spread around to this day. So at the time that was written, the story was, oh, the disciples stole the body. So the Jews knew where it was. And that's what number 5 says. No Roman or Jew claimed that the tomb still contained Jesus' body. So the next slide, was Jesus actually seen after his death? Again, the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, I mentioned that so many times already. Number 2, the Gospel and Acts have many accounts of eyewitness testimony of seeing Jesus alive. Number 3, Paul encouraged first century doubters to talk with the witnesses personally. He wasn't like, here's a story, and then try to keep moving on. He's like, no, if you don't believe me, go talk to the eyewitnesses themselves. They're still living. They can tell you, right? So go find out for yourself. Number 4, the claim that seeing Jesus alive as a result of hallucination does not hold up because it is impossible for everyone to have the same hallucination, and we talked about that. And then the next slide, we'll stop here on this slide, but the circumstantial evidence. This one, number 1, goes along with the video I showed last week. The disciples were willing to endure suffering and deprivation proclaiming the resurrection was true. So remember that video last week? The disciples, it says, if the resurrection was a hoax, and they got together and they said, hey, let's make up a story that Jesus rose from the dead. And then Apostle John was like, well, then what should we do? Or what are we going to get out of this? And they're like, nothing, we all die. And then he's like, I don't understand, why would we do this? And it just shows the absurdity of this idea that they would make this up and put their necks on the line for something that they knew was not true, right? I don't know anybody who would make up a lie. Like, I know people make up lies to give themselves an advantage, right? Or to help themselves. That's why people lie. They don't lie so that they can get in trouble, or that they can get persecution, or they can be thrown in prison, or they could be killed. Like, nobody does that. And so if they were making this up from the beginning, thinking that this would get them wealth and prestige, and then all of a sudden they started to realize, this is actually just getting us thrown in prison and killed, then I think that likely what would have happened is they would have said, you know what, this is not worth it. We'll come clean and tell you, you know what, we made the whole thing up, all right, we're just going to drop it. But they didn't do that. But a lot of people say, well, a lot of people are willing to die for things that they believe are true. Look at 9/11. The terrorists believed that if they would die in jihad, they would go to heaven and get 72 virgins. And that's why they were willing to go and die and fly into the towers. The difference is, this is where this all originates, right? This is where the story of Jesus' resurrection begins. And these were the eyewitnesses. They were in a position to know whether or not what they were saying was true. They had a different position than, say, those terrorists in the terrorist attacks in 9/11, because they were just believing on faith, that something was true, that the Quran was true, that Muhammad was really the prophet, and so forth. They were not actually eyewitness to those things. These apostles were the eyewitnesses to them. They knew whether or not it was true. All right, so they were in that position. There's no reason why skeptics like Paul and James would have been converted and then be willing to die for their faith. I mean, come on, Paul was a Pharisee. He was one of the leaders, and he was very zealous for God. Like, why would he all of a sudden have such a drastic change and then all of a sudden be, oh, now I'm a follower of Christ. Oh, now I'm willing to die for it. Or James, Jesus' brother. You read in John chapter 7, Jesus' brothers make fun of him and say that he's ridiculous, mock him, and say, hey, you should go up to the feast with us, and because you should show all the disciples the miracles that you can do. And it says because Jesus' brothers didn't believe in him. And then later James becomes one of the leaders of the church in Jerusalem. 3, Jews began abandoning sociological and religious practices, risking damnation if they were wrong. Yeah, they were willing to be thrown out of the synagogue to follow Jesus. Plus, the idea of God becoming man was just not in the Jewish wheelhouse, or, that's just, it was totally new, it was totally different. It's just not something that would have been created out of a Jewish culture, this idea of God becoming flesh, God becoming man, and then rising from the dead. And they believed in a resurrection. Well, some of them did. The Pharisees believed in a resurrection. The Sadducees rejected it. But the resurrection that they believed in was that there would be a resurrection at the end of the age, that there would be that type of a resurrection. But a resurrection that would happen for anybody in the middle of history, like, for example, Jesus, that was not even in their wheelhouse. So something happened to change their way of thinking. The early sacraments of communion and baptism affirmed the early belief in Jesus' resurrection and deity, because right from the get-go, they were already participating in communion and baptism. So that's an early idea. It wasn't created later. And number 5, the miraculous emergence of the church in the middle of Roman persecution supports the truth of the resurrection. How could this small movement from this poor rabbi from the region of Galilee in this backwater area of the Roman Empire go on to have such a huge and spread all over the world. There has to be something more significant to it than that he was just some great teacher or just some guy that claimed he was the Messiah and he was killed for it. There were many, many other people who claimed to be the Messiah and they were killed, and that was the end of it. But why did this movement continue after his death? Something significant had to have happened in order for this to become such a large movement throughout the Roman Empire and eventually throughout the entire world. And so that's where I'll leave it today. And so hopefully this has been helpful to bolster your confidence that the New Testament and the resurrection is a true historical event. So next week we'll pick up at, the last thing that we're going to talk about in this section, and then we're going to move on to Islam. The last thing we're going to talk about next week will be whether or not Jesus is a copy of other myths. Okay, because there's a lot of claim that if you look at some of the other ancient myths from Greek mythology or Roman mythology, are there similarities between Jesus and these myths? And if so, was Jesus just a copy of those, or what's actually going on there? So that's the last thing we're going to talk about before we move on to Islam. All right? Oh yes.
And when we think about history too, the Bible, as much as Satan has tried to use people to, get rid of the Bible,
Yeah.
burn people, torture, kill, and still lives on.
Yeah.
And it's the only book that really changes when it starts.
Yeah.
Inside out.
There's the supernatural aspect to it, yeah. The spiritual, not to mention the spiritual side of that as well. You could definitely see that it does change lives. And I know I mentioned why would that movement take off if something didn't happen, but also why would that movement be so successful without the intervention of God? And that's too with, like I said, we're going to get into Islam. And so what we'll see is we'll compare how did Islam spread versus how did Christianity spread. Because Christianity spread in spite of persecution. Islam spread by conquest. So Christianity spread by love and changing men's hearts. Islam just spread by we're going to dominate and spread by conquest. So two different things. Two different ways of spreading. So, all right. Oh, question.
I'm just thinking, did they really have drugs back in the day?
Yeah. And there were different types of drugs that they could use. I'm not an expert on all that, but yeah, there would have been things available to them that could cause hallucination. So there was such a thing. But again, if they had taken a drug to cause hallucination, they're not gonna all hallucinate the same thing. So. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions? Okay. Pick this up next week. Yep.
supposed to be greeter, but.
Not better than I've been.